My pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest today. Tanya Golash-Boza is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Merced. Professor Golash-Boza is a prolific author. She's published 5 sole-authored books and 35 articles and book chapters. Her scholarship ranges from issues of race and identity in Peru to human rights to immigration policy and deportation right here in the United States. Her latest book, Deported, explains mass deportation in the context of the global economic crisis. Yo Soy Negro, Blackness in Peru, explores discourses of blackness and racial identity in Peru. And her textbook, Race and Racisms, A Critical Approach, provides a critical overview of contemporary race scholarship. And these just sound like book titles, but teaching them in the classroom has really changed lives and empowered students that I've seen here on campus. So we're very grateful that she's here, and some of those students can thank her today. Professor Golash-Boza is a leader on campus and beyond. She was the inaugural chair of the Senate Committee on Diversity and Equity at UC Merced. In that role, she created the Faculty Equity Advisor Program at UC Merced and is currently serving as the vice chair of the UC System-Wide Committee on Affirmative Action, Diversity, and Equity. Professor Golash-Boza earned her BA in philosophy from the University of Maryland College Park and her PhD in sociology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2005. She speaks fluent French, Spanish, and Portuguese, so I think you're in good company here with some of our multilingual audience, and lives in Merced, California with her husband and 3 children. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tanya Golash-Boza.
Thank you, Jacob, for that generous introduction, and good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here and to be in the beautiful state of Utah. So today I'm going to talk about punishment beyond the deportee. And before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of context for deportations. And there's more seats if you'd like to come in. There's right up in the front where you get the prize for coming in. So deportations from the United States are at a historic high. Between 1997 and 2015, over 5 million people were deported from the United States. That's over twice the sum total of all deportations prior to 1996. So the current period is exceptional insofar as there has never been a time in U.S. history when we deported so many people. And this figure here explains that. As you can see, this is 1996 when we begin to see a rise in the number of deportations, and we deported people beginning in 1892. But in no single year were there ever more than 50,000 people deported from the United States. And I'm talking specifically about removals, which is the government term for deportations. So what happened in 1996 is that the laws were changed. So there were 2 laws that President Bill Clinton signed, 2 bills that President Bill Clinton signed into law. And basically what these laws did is they enhanced the grounds on which you could be deported and narrowed the grounds on which you could appeal a deportation. So a lot more people became deportable in 1996. But changing the laws alone is not really enough to deport people. You also need to spend money. So in order to deport large numbers of people, the federal government has to decide that they're going to spend a lot of money on deportations. So beginning in 1996, there were increasingly large sums of money invested in the Immigration Naturalization Service, the INS, in order to facilitate these deportations. And as you'll notice, deportations kind of leveled off in the early 2000s. But then, beginning in 2003, we see another spike in deportations, and then they just increase steadily between 2003 and 2012. So what happened in 2003 is that the Department of Homeland Security was created. So the former INS was replaced by the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security is an enormous federal government agency. It's among the largest of the federal government agencies, almost as large as the Department of Education. So the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in the name of the War on Terror and in the aftermath of 9/11 led to an even larger number of people being deported from the United States. So in addition to there being a lot of deportations, there are also clear race and gendered patterns in deportations. So over the past decade, 91% of people removed from the United States have been men, and 91% are from 4 countries: Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. In 2016, 98% of people deported from the United States were from the Americas. So only 60% of all non-citizens in the United States are from the Americas, but they made up 98% of deportees. 91% of deportees are men, but only about half of all non-citizens are men. So last year, out of 340,000 deportees, only 3,104 were deported to Asia, 1,421 to Europe, and 1,449 to Africa. Right? So the number of people deported to the Americas far outpaces the number of people deported to the Americas. And deportations have been promulgated as an anti-terrorism policy. But we never, almost never, deport people to countries the United States government associates with terrorism. So last year, 19 people were deported to Iran, 12 people were deported to Yemen, and 10 to Syria. So of the countries on Trump's travel ban list, only Venezuela, which is in Latin America, has a significant number of deportees. Last year, 701 people were deported to Venezuela. And I can show you that's not related to the war on terrorism. It's related to the racialized and gendered policing of Latin Americans in the United States. So mass deportation is gendered and raced. Thus, its collateral consequences are also gendered and race. So we're seeing right now an unseen historical moment of extremely high deportations, and these deportations are directed specifically at one particular population, which is Latin American and Caribbean men. So let me just go over the data a little bit for you, so bear with me if you're not that fascinated by data. But with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2003, we began to see an increase in interior removals. So when a person is deported from the United States, that deportation can either be classified as an interior removal or a border removal. A border removal is a person who's apprehended along the US border, attempting to enter the United States, and then subsequently is deported to their country of origin. An interior removal is a person who's apprehended inside of the United States. Most of the time when a person is deported through an interior removal, they're living in the United States, and most of the time with a border removal, they're not living in the United States. But it's not 100%. So beginning in 2003, we began to see an increase in interior and removals. Those are deportations generally of people living in the United States. Between 2003 and 2013, 648,000 people who had lived in the United States for at least 3 years were deported. 1/3 of those people, 200,000, had lived in the United States for at least 10 years. So between 2003 and in 2013, we deported 200,000 people who had lived in the United States for at least 10 years. This amounts to Salt Lake City being depleted of its entire population over the course of 10 years, or perhaps more accurately, imagine if every single father in Utah with a child under the age of 18 were removed from this country over the course of 10 years. So a lot of people have been deported, have been taken from families, and this is a policy that's relatively new and that was not implemented on large scale prior to the 1990s. And we do have a little bit updated data, and I want to share this with you particularly because there's a lot of concern about the current era as compared to previous eras. And what I'd like to drive home the fact is that interior removals peaked, the all-time peak in their history, during the first term of the Obama administration. So we actually saw a decline. We've seen a decline in interior removals since 2011, but interior removals reached a peak in 2009, and then 2010, and 2011, and then they began to decline. So for those of you that can't see, the blue lines are interior removals. So 2009 was the absolute peak in the history of the United States with over 200,000 interior removals. Then it began to decline a little bit, 2010, 2011, 2012, all the way over to here. And you'll hear reports that 2017, the first year of the Trump administration, there was an increase, and as you can see, there's a very small increase from 2016, but it's still nowhere near where we were in the first term of the Obama administration. So just so you understand, there was a large number of deportations of interior removals between 2003 and 2013. There has been a slight drop-off, but we're still experiencing the consequences because when a person is removed from a family, there's long-term consequences for that family, which I'm going to explain today. So there haven't been a lot of studies on the collateral consequence of deportation. We don't have comprehensive data that would really allow us to understand exactly what happened or what has happened or exactly how many people who have been deported, but we have some studies that kind of give us some insight. So one study found that 18% of Central American deportees have children in the US under the age of 5, right? So after Mexico, the primary place that we send deportees is Central America, and almost 1 in 5 of them have a child under the age of 5. Another study found that Mexico, which is where most deportees Mexican deportees had lived an average of 9 years in the United States. And then another study found that half of all Mexican deportees have US citizen relatives. So alongside this increase in interior removals over the past decade, we have seen considerable collateral consequences for the family members of deportees. So Megan Comfort references punishment beyond the legal offender to describe the experiences of families of incarcerated people. Given the parallels between incarceration and deportation, I ask, is there punishment beyond the deportee for family members? Before I do this, though, I want to clarify that there may be punishment beyond the deportee, but technically, deportation is not punishment. So I clarified this in one of my books. So under US law, being deported is not a punishment for a crime. It's an additional consequence, perhaps after serving a criminal sentence, for having served a criminal sentence, for a person who's not a citizen, or it's just an administrative procedure through which a person who has never committed a crime is removed from the United States. So it's interesting because in the United States, undocumented migrants are not criminals, detention is not prison, and deportation is not punishment. However, undocumented immigrants are talked about and treated like criminals. Detainees feel like they're in prison and often are housed in prison facilities, and deportees experience their exclusion as punishment. It's important that deportation is not punishment. It's important to know that because people facing deportation are not afforded the same due process protections as people that are facing criminal punishment. So if you're suspected of a murder in the United States, you're accorded a certain set of rights in a criminal trial, including the right to a lawyer if you're unable to afford one. But if you're facing deportation, which many people experience as an extreme punishment, you're not afforded those same protections, right? You're not afforded the right to a jury trial. You're not afforded the right to a lawyer. You're not afforded the same due process protection. You don't even get to see a judge. I mean, you get to see a person who's called a judge. They're called an immigration judge. But as you know, they're not, in the United States, judges are in the judicial branch. But an immigration judge is actually an employee of the Department of Justice, which is in the executive branch, right? So there's not due process separation of powers in the deportation system. So I just want to clarify, I'm talking about deportation as punishment, but I mean that in the rhetorical sense that people experience it as punishment because it's not technically punishment in US law. So I designed a research project along with my graduate student, Marcus Shaw, and we wanted to understand how families respond to deportation. And we wanted to understand particularly, are there parallels between the collateral consequences of incarceration and the collateral consequences of deportation? So between 2013 and 2018, so up until very recently, we've been interviewing people in the Central Valley of California who have been affected by deportation. And this study has taken a very long time because it is actually quite difficult to find people, even though there have been, from Merced County where I live, there have been over 1,000 people deported, but it's not that easy to find people who are willing to talk about their experiences with deportation. So with this ongoing study, we're hoping to get at least 3 more interviews to have a solid 30 interviews, which makes a nice qualitative study. But they'll probably be able to get published with 27, so, but we're still looking for 3 more people. So this is ongoing research, so I appreciate your questions and feedback. The paper's under review. So let's look at incarceration and deportation to understand, are there parallels between these 2 systems of legal punishment and technical punishment? So incarceration and deportation follow similar patterns. With incarceration, a person is first apprehended, by a police officer, and then they are taken to jail or prison, and then they're released. The pattern is similar for deportation. Anybody who's deported from the United States is first apprehended. Like I explained earlier, there's border removals and interior removals. Along the border, it's possible to be apprehended by Customs and Border Patrol, but we're not talking about those kinds of deportations today. It is possible for a person who's living in the United States to be deported by Border Patrol, but those make up the minority of cases for the Border Patrol, so we're just not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about ICE deportations, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the other agency that does deportations. So a deportation also starts with an arrest, because you have to be apprehended in order to get into the deportation pipeline, is followed by detention, and then you're removed. So as you can see, it's a very similar process. You're arrested, and so the question is, is being arrested by ICE, does that feel similar to being arrested by police? Is that different? Then you're sent to jail, prison. Is that different from being sent to deportation? And then you're released back into your community versus being removed. So this is the kind of question, what are the parallels between these 2 systems of punishment in the United States? Okay, so deportations begin with an apprehension. They can either be police-initiated deportations or ICE-initiated deportations. So a police-initiated deportation is when you're a person in the United States and you're apprehended by local law enforcement. This could be for driving without a license, driving under the influence, suspect in a robbery, suspect in a murder, any kind of crime. Basically, if a law enforcement official wants to arrest you, they basically have to have reasonable suspicion that you may have committed a crime, and then they can arrest you, right? Citizen or not. So no distinction is made in the criminal justice system as to whether or not you could be potentially arrested. If you are a citizen of the United States and you're driving down the highway and you're pulled over and you don't have a driver's license, the police officer could choose to arrest you. They probably won't, but they could choose to arrest you if they believe they're unable to establish your identification and they wanted to arrest you. I've been pulled over without a license and I didn't get arrested, but it could happen. It's just that if you're not a citizen of the United States, they might be more likely. Studies have found that they are more likely to arrest people who are not citizens, but that's discrimination on the basis of citizenship, which is actually illegal in the United States. So anyway, you're arrested by the police officer, then you're taken to jail, right? Because basically the police officer can't just deport you on the street. They do not have the powers of immigration law enforcement. But if a police officer stops you for driving, stops you and finds that you're driving without a license, like you're speeding, they pull you over, you don't have a driver's license. And they decide, well, I can't establish who you are, so I'm going to take you down to the police station to find out who you are. They take you down to the jail, and then at the jail, there could, if that police agency cooperates with immigration law enforcement, there could be an ICE agent at the jail, and they could then pass you over to that person. But they can't just pass you over. Well, they technically are not supposed to just pass you over on the streets, although I have heard of those kinds of things happening along the border. But let's say that you are pulled over and suspected of driving under the influence, and then you're taken to jail, and then you're given a 30-day sentence for driving under the influence. Then you do your 30 days in jail, and then they give you to ICE. Or you could be pulled over, suspected of cocaine possession, found to be guilty of possessing a narcotic, serve a year in prison, and then be sent over to ICE. So basically, there's always going to be a jail. With a police-initiated arrest, you're always going to spend some time in jail and possibly in prison. Prison is generally reserved for people that get a sentence of a year or more. Okay, then after that, you're going to be passed over to detention, which could possibly be in the same facility as a jail, but like I said, it's not technically a jail because now you're not serving a criminal sentence. You're just being held awaiting your deportation or awaiting your immigration proceedings. And then at the end of it, you're removed to your country of origin. Now, that's a police-initiated deportation, and then you have an ICE-initiated deportation where you're arrested directly by ICE, taken directly to a detention facility, probably to multiple detention facilities, and then you're removed. Now, if it's a police-initiated deportation, you can see pretty clearly that it feels a lot like the criminal justice system, because the first two steps are basically the same as the criminal justice system. The second two steps are just a little different. Now, you should know that most deportees are first arrested by a police officer. So the deportation machine is in many ways the same apparatus as the criminal justice apparatus, because the majority of deportations are police-initiated. In 2016, ICE agents took 65,332 people into custody. Over 3/4 of these people were first apprehended by police and then handed over to ICE agents. Only 20% of these people, about 13,000, were directly arrested by ICE agents in home or worksite raids. For most deportees, deportations begin in exactly the same fashion as incarceration, which is arrest by local law enforcement. So arrests by police officers and ICE home raids are the most common ways non-citizens are apprehended. So police is by far the most common. So when we're thinking about people who are apprehended within the United States and then sent to their countries of origin, it's almost always they're first apprehended by local law enforcement. That's the most common. The second most common is an ICE home raid, but these are really not that common either, but the second most common. So in 2016, there were 13,000 people who were apprehended in an ICE home raid. This is when you have a group, an ICE team of about 6 to 12 officers who go to someone's house very early in the morning, knock on the door, the person answers the door, they say, is Juan Herrera here? They have a judicial warrant for his arrest, they have a warrant for they have an administrative warrant for his arrest, and then if Juan is there or not there, they arrest him and then take him to the detention center, and then he's deported. But as you can see, that takes a lot of manpower, right? Because basically you have to have 6 to 12 agents, go to one person's house, pull them out of the house, and then deport them. And there aren't that many ICE agents in the country. Anyone want to take a guess at how many ICE agents there are in the United States? In the whole United States? 2,000? Close? 20,000? There's actually there might be 20,000 employees of ICE, but there are only 5,000 ICE agents in the whole country. So when President Trump first came to office, he said he wanted to expand that police force to 10,000, and he hasn't yet been able to do that. It's actually very difficult to expand any police force, and historically, when you expand a police force rapidly, it leads to not very great things in terms of justice and procedure. But we haven't been able to expand it. So right now there's 5,000 ICE agents, so just, you can imagine not very many people are directly apprehended in home raids because they take a lot of manpower. But how many of you had heard of home raids? Yeah, we hear about them because when they happen, they make the news. Because they're extremely terrifying. They terrify that family, they terrify the whole block, the whole community, the whole city. The media reports on it. They're scary, but they're not that common. The second way that ICE could apprehend people is through a worksite raid. Now, during the administration of George W. Bush, there were many high-profile ICE worksite raids. You may remember in 2006, or you might not remember if you're too young, but there was a huge raid in Hiram, Utah, on the Swift meatpacking factory. So there was a raid of many of the Swift companies in 2006, and there was one of them happened to be in Utah. The other ones were in Colorado and other places around the country. But those are huge, high-profile raids. But again, those raids take hundreds of agents, and they apprehend 100 people, 200 people. I think the record was set in Postville, Iowa, when you had 300 agents descend on a meatpacking factory in Postville, Iowa in 2008, and they apprehended 300 people, right? And the operation took 6 months to carry out. So they make the news, they make the headlines, they invoke a lot of fear in communities, but not very common. And actually, after Postville, there was a huge government investigation of Postville because people's rights were denied, and there was a sort of overlapping of the criminal justice process with the immigration process that was found to not be so savory. So they stopped, during the Obama administration, they stopped doing these high-profile worksite raids. In the Obama administration, they did a few lower-profile raids of chicken factories in Alabama and Arkansas. But we don't see a lot of worksite raids very much, although a few weeks ago there were reported worksite raids in 7-Elevens. And again, those made national news, but I think they apprehended 98 people. So again, very high profile. They're basically spectacles, but they don't end up leading to very many deportations. And then there's the ICE street arrest, which technically is not supposed to happen. Because if you think about it, like I know that if I were just walking down the street and a federal agent came to me and said, "Are you a US citizen?" I'd be like, "Am I being detained or am I free to go?" Which is what you should say, because you're not, they have no right, like a federal agent has no right to detain you on the street if you're not suspected of a crime. And considering that I don't generally engage in criminal activity, and I certainly wouldn't give them any reason to think that I was, that's what I would say, I think, although it is, when you're actually apprehended by a federal agent, you may act differently because it is very stressful to be apprehended by someone with a big black uniform and 2 huge guns in their holster. But I hope I would be able to say, am I being detained, or am I free to go? If I were able to get up the wherewithal to say that, they should tell me, "Oh, you're free to go," and then I would leave and I wouldn't answer the question, I think. But that's how it's supposed to go. But apparently there have been ICE street arrests. So I live in, and those have happened during the Trump administration, even though they're technically not supposed to happen. Because as you can see, like, the Border Patrol can ask you about your citizenship if you're within 100 miles of the border and you look like you just came across the border. They're allowed to do that. But if you don't live within 100 miles of the border, ICE agents are not supposed to just they don't have a license to just roam the streets picking people up. But apparently they've done it, so which creates fear in communities. So I live in Merced, California, and just the next town over, just 5 miles up the road, is a town called Atwater, which, like many towns in the Central Valley, hosts a huge prison facility, a federal prison facility in this case. And in Atwater, about a couple of weeks ago, there was a team of ICE agents, and they went to someone's house to try to apprehend them, you know, as they're supposed to do. They have a warrant. They went to see if this person still lived there. The person wasn't there, so the ICE agent went back to their raid was unsuccessful. So they're probably feeling a little demoralized. Here I'm extrapolating. I'm just thinking, who knows? But they didn't have anyone to take back to their office. So they went to the Circle K. So this is a picture of a 7-Eleven, sorry. But Circle K is basically the same thing, except for they have gas stations. Anyway, so they went to the Circle K, which is by the highway. And they went in there to buy coffee. And they saw that in there, it was a Sunday morning, but there was a group of 4 people also buying coffee. And the ICE agents noticed that they were there. And then they went out. The ICE agents went outside of the store, and when the 4 men left the store, the ICE agents said, "Hey, you don't look like you belong here. Are you a U.S. citizen?" And 3 of the men didn't respond. The men didn't respond at first, and then one of them was like, "Well, I'm a legal permanent resident." And he happened to have his card on him, and actually, if you are a legal permanent resident, you are required to carry your card with you at all times. He showed his card, and they were like, "I don't know, this looks kind of fake to me." But they gave it back to him. And then the other 3 guys did not have documents to be in the United States. And the ICE agents actually apprehended them on the streets in the Circle K and took them to Fresno and deported. They deported one of them. The other 2 asked to appeal their cases because they had lived in the United States for a long time and they may be eligible for some form of immigration relief. Now, according to ICE, that's not supposed to happen, but it does happen. And when that happens in a community, like where I live, a small community that's 10% undocumented, people begin to get scared, right? So there's a reign of terror in the community based on this relatively uncommon way. So there's already collateral consequences just because of the way immigration law is being enforced today, right? So let's go back to the study. I just wanted to give you the broader context of immigration, criminal law enforcement, and the overlaps. So like I said before, for any deportee, the first step in the deportation pipeline is arrest. And the same thing for any person that ends up in prison. Arrest is first. So witnessing this event, witnessing the arrest is stressful for family members. After arrest, the person facing deportation is either taken to jail or a detention center. And family members describe this process as criminalizing and dehumanizing. So one of our interviewees, Joanna, is a student at the University of California, Merced. Her parents have a small business making clothes in their home near South Central Los Angeles. So Joanna was born in the United States, but like many families, it's a mixed status family, so her brother was born in Mexico, and her brother was not a legal resident or a US citizen. So her family was just getting ready for bed when the police showed up at her house looking for her brother, who was suspected of a violent crime which had occurred on their block. So Joanna explained what happened when the police came to their house. Joanna said, "We were pulled out like animals. I think that's what hurt me the most. We walked out barefoot, and my dad with his underwear, because they didn't even let him put on anything. There were 7 cops lined up, and they expected us to pass through there with our hands up and half-naked barefoot, walking downstairs with their guns pointed at us. I remember everyone was trying to look, and they were saying some words that made it seem like we were a house full of criminals. So the large number of police officers induced fear and enhanced the sense of criminalization and dehumanization, not just for her brother, but for the whole family. It was also difficult for family members to see their loved ones behind bars, and they often worried about them. So Joanna's parents worried constantly about her brother, who had just turned 18, and he was sent to a men's prison. And there are studies that show that when young boys are sent to men's prisons, they're more likely to be victims of various kinds of assault. So Joanna vividly remembered seeing her father break down in tears when just thinking about the fact that his young son was in prison. Joanna said, "I saw my dad cry for the first time. I remember him crying for the first time, and I was just like, my dad's crying." I was like, that's terrible. You never want to see your son in prison. So family members expressed concern about what might happen to their loved ones behind bars where they didn't think their family members were safe. And family members did not really make a distinction between whether their family member was in a county jail, a prison, or an immigration detention center. They basically experienced these 3 forms of criminalization and detention in a very similar fashion. And prison and detention center rules also pose a problem for interviewees. Joanna described going to see her brother in a detention center in Central California and ultimately being denied entry. So she was pretty sure it was an immigration detention center, but interesting, like she wasn't even 100% sure. Because like I said, if you go visit an immigration detention center or a prison, it's very difficult for a layperson to tell the difference because they feel very similar. So Joanna said, it's like a 5-hour drive and then a 2-hour wait from Los Angeles. Oh man, I hated them so much. I remember I was so excited. My mom told me I was going to see my brother, and I hadn't seen him in a year, so I was very excited. We got there early so there wouldn't be a line. And so I go through the whole process, and at the end, they just tell me I can't go in. It was one of the cruelest things ever. Joanna doesn't explain the reason she was given for being barred. Detention centers, jails, and prisons often have dress codes and other rules that may be difficult to anticipate. There also could have been a lockdown, meaning no visitors were accepted for a period of time. When a person is arrested and detained, they experience a sense of rightlessness, and this experience spreads to family members when they attempt to make contact with their loved ones behind bars. So arrest and detention themselves are often stressful, whether it's arrest by police officers, arrest by an ICE agent, detention in a jail, prison, detention center, all were stressful for family members. But the aftermath is also stressful. So deportation often entails the loss of a breadwinner. And the financial impacts and the loss of an adult from a household can be dramatic. Some respondents' families had to move to less expensive housing. Some of the interviewees were teenagers when their single parents were deported, and they had to quickly take on adult roles. In many cases, teenage youth found themselves in charge of their younger siblings. Laura and her sister were both born in San Jose, California, and they lived with both of their parents, who were both from Jalisco, Mexico. Laura's dad worked in construction, and her mother worked in a deli. So Laura's mother was diagnosed with breast cancer and had to stop working when Laura was 10 years old. And then her mother passed away when Laura was just 13. So her father found it difficult to handle living in the city with 2 teenage daughters, and he decided to move the family from San Jose to Chowchilla, California, which is a small town in the Central Valley where a third of the population lives in one of the 2 prisons in the Central Valley. But he found work in an almond farm, and Laura and her sister went to school. So when Laura was finishing up the 10th grade in Chowchilla, her father was arrested. He had just purchased a secondhand car and was driving it without license plates or registration. When the officer pulled him over, he discovered that her father had been drinking. The officer arrested her father and took him to Madera County Jail. So Laura went to visit him in jail, and near tears, she explained, the first time was hard. You see them through a glass. He's not a bad person, and that just makes him look like a criminal. When Laura's father was arrested, Laura's sister had just turned 18. Thus, Laura's father was able to authorize her sister as a legal guardian. So they survived on Laura's income from their part-time job for 2 months until their extended family decided they should move in with a family member in San Jose, which is a couple hours from Chowchilla where they had been living. So Laura explained, the day after my sister turned 18, that's when my dad got arrested. I guess technically she was allowed to take care of me because he notarized a letter saying she would be my guardian until I was of legal age. We lived by ourselves for 2 months. My sister was 18 and I was 16. We were there by ourselves and I was the only one working. It was hard. I was 16 with a part-time job. How was I supposed to pay rent? It was hard. We managed to do it for 2 months. That's when he got deported. So basically they stayed in town until the deportation proceedings were over. And then they moved in with with her mom's nieces back in San Jose. So Joanna Dreby describes a family situation when the father is deported as the mother becoming suddenly single. But one additional thing I found is that when the father is deported, or when one parent is deported from a single parent family, the children often become abruptly adults. So we found this over and over again where relatively young people would suddenly be responsible for taking care of the whole family when one or both of their parents were deported. So now let's look at post-deportation. When a family member is incarcerated, in some cases they're able to return home after the incarceration to an intact family. When a family member is deported, they're sometimes able to return to the United States, but usually illegally and then have to live in the shadows. In other cases, the family members might live in the country of birth and the deported person abroad, and then sometimes the whole family goes to the place of origin of the deported person. So many of the family members of the people we interviewed were deported to places where life is difficult. Those family members who were deported to Mexico had to worry about the possibility of being kidnapped or extorted, in addition to living in poverty. Agustina's brother, for example, was kidnapped after he was deported. And basically what happens is a person who's lived in the United States for a very long time, if they're deported to Mexico, the people in Mexico can pretty easily tell that they have relatives in the United States, that they've lived in the United States. And if they move to an area, if they're from an area with high levels of criminal activity, criminal networks, then many of those criminal networks in Mexico engage in extortion. So they basically will kidnap the person and say, you better call your family in the United States and pay us thousands of dollars until we release you. And this happens repeatedly. Of course, it's not very often reported to the authorities because they basically just call their family members in the United States, get the money sent, and then have to hope that that doesn't happen again. But a lot of people are concerned that this could happen to their family members, and they worry about their family members' safety in Mexico. Aside from violence and fear, it's also hard for people to know that their family member lives in circumstances of deprivation. So Roberto expressed sorrow at how his aunt and cousins, who previously led middle-class lives in the United States, now live in poverty in Mexico. He's like, they don't have running water. They don't have all the necessities we have here. The house is small. It's made of adobe. The restroom's outside. So when people saw their family members living in poverty, it made them feel very guilty about whatever they had in the United States. Even if they were pretty low income in the United States, they felt like they had basic amenities that their family members whom they love and care about deeply don't have access to in Mexico, and that made them feel bad for them. Many of the people that we interviewed have also returned to the United States. Their family has returned to the United States illegally, particularly people from Mexico often take great risk to their life and to return to the United States to be with their loved ones. But then they're living under the radar and they're scared. So Diana explained, so Diana's aunt was deported and the kids were here, and then the aunt came back to the United States to be with her children. And Diana was like, the kids are traumatized. They came back, they're here, they're afraid to drive. She doesn't have the kids in school with a different phone number, different emergency contacts with different numbers. The kids don't even call their dad by his name. They call him by another name that's not his. And the kids don't even know that's not their dad's name. So basically, these extreme precautions also take a toll, right? Because the parents are worried about being deported. They're worried about something happening to them or their kids, and this sort of takes a toll, a psychological toll on the family, this sort of fear of what might happen to them now that they're possibly targets. And if they are apprehended after having been deported, if they're apprehended, they now face the possibility of a federal sentence of up to 20 years in prison for illegal re-entry to the United States. So in conclusion, there is punishment beyond the deportee. The process of deportation is itself criminalizing, which negatively affects family members who must bear witness to their loved ones facing the brute force of the state. The loss of a breadwinner can cause a financial crisis in the household, and families are often permanently torn apart. So family members of deportees pay a significant price when their loved one is deported. These collateral consequences of deportation disproportionately affect the most vulnerable members of our society. Poor or working-class Latino men are the most common targets of deportation. The family members affected by deportation and incarceration also belong to marginalized and vulnerable groups, racial and ethnic minorities, women and children, and poor and working class people. So these collateral consequences of deportation, like the collateral consequences of incarceration, exacerbate existing race, class, and gender inequities. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. We ask for the benefit of our listening and recording audience that you come up to the mic over here to ask your question. And if you're a BYU student, please tell us who you are and what you're studying.
My name's John Richens. I'm studying sociology. Would you describe your ideal U.S. immigration policy?
Would I describe you really want to know? So,
Absolutely.
okay. Well, ideal. So I'm a sociologist, not a policymaker. And I believe that in my book, Deported, I argue that our deportation policies exacerbate global apartheid. So basically, the way the world is organized is you have the resources of the world are unevenly distributed around the world. So if you're born in the United States, even if you're born into poverty, your life chances are already far better than the vast majority of people in the world. And that's what, I can't remember the name right now, but that's what Shahar calls the birthright lottery. So if you're born in the United States, you win the birthright lottery. But what have you done to earn that? And what have the other people that are not born in the United States done to earn their lives of deprivation? So I think that in a vastly unequal global society, it's completely unfair to say that people can't come to the United States and enjoy the benefits that we receive here. And I do definitely recognize that that it's possible that if we had very high levels of immigration, that might infringe on our standard of living, but I'm pretty sure that you don't need 2,500 square feet in an air-conditioned household and 3 cars to survive.
I really appreciate your presentation and your work. I work in the School of Education here. On 2 levels, I'm from the Central Valley. I grew up on a small farm in the Central Valley. And secondly, a colleague and I do some work with U.S. citizen students in Mexico. So there's about 600,000. So like the total public school population of Utah is spread throughout Mexico, and they're U.S. citizen students, so we kind of think about their experiences. One of the things that we found, though, is that kind of disentangling the reasons that their family left is kind of difficult because it seems like there's a lot of stigma around deportation. So depending on the work that you look at, it's a combination of like economic and family reunification and deportation. And I'm just wondering, how you encounter the role of stigma in your work and how that kind of makes it challenging to actually find what the reasons are. And second, what are some of the roles of these other factors like the economy, the economic crisis, and just reunification of families?
Yeah, thanks. No, it's interesting because in the United States, all the data point very clearly to the fact that if you're African American and have any contact with drugs or people that use drugs, your likelihood of going to prison is extremely high. But nevertheless, there's still a stigma associated with that. There's still a stigma associated with being caught with illegal drugs and going to prison. So many people in positions of power, of course, have engaged in illegal acts. Actually, almost everybody, maybe not at BYU, but almost sorry. Maybe almost everyone in the United States has engaged in illegal activity. But obviously, not everyone goes to prison. And I think there's like 10 million illegal drug users in the United States, but obviously we don't want to put all 10 million of them in prison. That wouldn't be a good use of our resources. There's a stigma with going to prison, but somehow that stigma is like the stigma of being caught, right? Because most people have engaged in some activity that could possibly end them up in jail. And it's similar with deportation, right? There's not a stigma in the undocumented community necessarily with being undocumented, but there sometimes is a stigma associated with being deported. So again, there's like the stigma of being caught. And it varies tremendously by community. So in Mexico and in Central America, in Mexico in particular, I'd say the stigma is partly about being caught, like, oh, you weren't like together. You weren't smart enough to evade the authorities, like you got caught. Yeah. And then there's also the stigma, like, well, if you got caught, you probably were doing something you shouldn't have been doing, and that's associated with the fact that most people are first apprehended by criminal justice authorities and then deported. But it's interesting, I also did research in Brazil, and in Brazil, there's no stigma associated with deportation, right? So even though Brazil is in the top sending countries of deportees, there's almost no stigma associated with deportation. And then at the total opposite end of the spectrum is the Dominican Republic. So in the Dominican Republic, if you're deported on criminal grounds, you are processed as a criminal when you arrive in the Dominican Republic, and then you're issued a piece of paper that basically says that you're a deportee. And the way it works in the Dominican Republic is that any job in the formal sector that you want to get, you have to show your criminal, you have to do a criminal background check, and deportation comes up on that. So there's like an official stigma in the DR. So like I said, it varies by country. And Mexico's sort of on the end towards somewhat less stigma, but it's going to vary probably regionally in Mexico.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Elise Gutierrez. I'm studying human development, and I'm from Delano, California.
All right.
For
Cesar
those that
Chavez.
don't know, yeah, that's Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. My question is, for those who didn't grow up in the Central Valley or like didn't grow up very aware of this and are learning now, what is your advice for, I guess, the next step to help?
Yeah, so in the Central Valley, what we're doing is, so in California, they passed a law called SB 54, which limits the ability of police to interact with immigration law enforcement. So if you're interested in this politically, I would look into what kind of state laws you could pass in Utah. And because basically, if you limit the extent to which police can interact with immigration, you're going to limit the number of people that are deported after a simple arrest by local law enforcement. So if you're interested in looking into that in Utah. And then in California, we're actually looking at implementation of SB 54 because, like you said, not everybody knows the Central Valley. So California is known pretty well as like the progressive state, solidly Democrat, and that's true. But the Central Valley is a lot more mixed, and but it's an interesting place. The Central Valley has much of its wealth. Well, first of all, the Central Valley is where the gold rush happened. So that was the initial rush to the Central Valley, the gold rush in 1848. That brought a lot of people seeking opportunities and fortunes, and also led to a pretty massive genocide of the Native American population. But the Central Valley is also where a lot of immigrants have come to work in the field. So basically, if you've had strawberries this year, they probably came from, they came from Watsonville, which is right next to Strawberry. But if you've had almonds, I guarantee you, they come from the Central Valley. So most of the food you eat comes from the Central Valley. The grapes, 90% of the table grapes produced in the United States come from the Central Valley. And that's basically on the backs of agricultural workers in the Central Valley. So the Central Valley is interesting because the economy 100% relies on immigrants. But what I've found in the Central Valley and elsewhere is the economy definitely relies on immigrants to produce the food that we eat, not just in the Central Valley, but around the world, to take care of children for everybody in the Central Valley and then in California, to tend people's gardens, right? But in some ways, the way that immigrants are treated in the Central Valley is in such a way that we're ensured that we can extract their labor in the ways that's most convenient to the people in charge. So we have a very strong reliance on immigrants, and people in the Central Valley do not want all of the immigrants to be deported, but a lot of people that are in power and hold economic power in the Central Valley do want the immigrants to remain in a position of vulnerability. And I'll just say, since you mentioned Delano, I mean, the United Farm Workers strike in Delano, California, and then the subsequent uprisings were tremendous. But the life of farm workers is still pretty terrible. So even though we had this sort of very strong movement, unionization of farm workers, the actual life conditions of farm workers in the Central Valley has changed very little since the 1960s. And one thing you should know about the Central Valley too, a lot of places in the Central Valley don't even have clean water, like just as a starting point.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Angus Benyon. I'm a psychology major. I wanted to ask a question about sanctuary cities. During periods of high deportation, do you see rises in population in sanctuary cities? What kind of role do they play, if any?
Yeah, so I mean, I think sanctuary cities, basically what California has done, for example, as a state, is say we're going to limit the interaction between immigration law enforcement and the federal and the local police, and that sort of creates a sanctuary. And you see other cities adopting these policies to certain levels or not, but immigration is the purview of the federal government, right? So even though California is a sanctuary state, there's no one in California that can prevent immigration and customs enforcement agents from carrying out an administrative warrant if you can't stop them. So I think the sanctuary cities and states, it's an empirical question, and maybe Jacob would be able to answer that question. Does that actually lead to fewer deportations by county? There's new data coming out that would let us know, whether or not it's actually leading to fewer deportations. I'm not 100% sure whether or not it is. I would say, though, that a lot of what's going on today, though, is mostly about the rhetoric of fear, right? So what we're hearing from the White House is we're going to find all the immigrants, we're going to deport them, we're going to build a wall, we're going to get them out, and that creates fear in immigrant communities. So I think if the locality responds with another symbolic gesture, saying, we're going to create a sanctuary city, that's a sort of another symbolic response to the fear. So it's it may be rhetorical to some extent, but I think that helps, especially in the current moment. And as to whether or not people would move to those sanctuary cities, I'm not 100% sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm
Hi.
Heidi Blanco. I'm a sociology major. So I come from a mixed status family, and just hearing about all these problems in mass deportation and families being ripped apart, do you have any ideas of how we could help those families? I know sometimes it'd be policy changes of reuniting families, but any sort of thing that we could do that doesn't involve policy changes to help them reunite or have an easier life,
Yeah.
I guess, after that.
Yeah, so in California, people have formed what's called rapid response networks, where, and the rapid response network is a team of people where if a person is confronting deportation, then they can call this hotline, and then there's a group of people that will come out and help them. So the first thing that person would do is someone would show up and try and document the event, as a legal observer. Mm-hmm. Again, so if you have a citizenship rights and you're able to show up to a deportation event or a deportation attempt, so if ICE agents show up at someone's house here in Provo, if a team of 3 or 4 U.S. citizens were able to go and just watch what happens, you may be able to make sure that the law is actually enforced, right? So you would also be giving support to the people inside that house. Because basically what happens is 90% of the time, ICE agents go to someone's house with an administrative warrant, not a judicial warrant, and an administrative warrant does not give them the right to knock down that person's door. So the people could just stay in the house and not open the door. And if there were legal observers watching, then they could make sure that in filming, then ICE would be less likely to actually do it. And then more to your point, so if the deportation does actually take place, because it didn't happen through a home raid, or the ICE agents were successful in deporting the person, the rapid response team then goes to that family and provides them with emotional, psychological support. You can create a handbook of resources to help families who've been through that experience. You can create, before the fact, in California, a lot of people have been creating emergency preparedness plans. So not in case of a tornado, but in case a person is deported, who to call, who's going to pick up the kid from school, right? And that just gives people a sense of okay, if I'm deported, at least I know that this person's going to pick up my kid from school, this person's going to call my husband, this person's going to call my other kids. So kind of a plan is also, and there's documents all over the internet for how to set up both of those kinds of systems of support. And sometimes that way of getting organized also creates a sense of security in the community.
Thank you.
Yeah. And just to add, I've been asked by immigrants in my community to get more citizen allies to help, because they really want that support right now, especially from people who have citizenship status and are able to provide that support.
My name is McKay Mitchell. I'm a sociology student here. And I think you mentioned how there is not a lot of research on this topic of the effects of deportation. And I was wondering if you've thought about or know of somebody who would look at sort of the longitudinal effects of this on the children, of parents who are deported.
And actually, I should correct myself to say that there is actually a lot of work in Mexico of people who've returned. But like your colleague said earlier, we're not always 100% sure if they were deported or they returned voluntarily, because people don't always share that information. So I think there's pretty massive studies going on in Mexico right now, and what the researchers in Mexico are doing is going into schools and finding children who are new enrollees that had lived in the United States, sort of understand what happens to those kids in Mexico. So I think we are gaining an understanding of what happens to them. As far as the families left behind, I think it would be hard to organize a quantitative study, because it is a relatively, to do a good quantitative study, you need to do a random sample. So it'd be really hard to get a random sample of people who have a family member who's been deported, because it does affect a relatively small percentage of the overall United States population. So I think qualitative research is where we're going to really be able to understand, tease apart some of these effects, and probably larger scale qualitative studies, and probably be easier to do those studies in places like New York or Los Angeles, which have larger populations of families left behind.
Thanks.
One more question? Okay.
Sorry, this is a short one. I'm Lear Burton. I'm also a sociology student. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the plan to ask about immigration status in the 2020 census.
Yeah, so you all should know that the United States asked about citizenship status in the 1940 and 1950 census, and that information was used to apprehend and detain Japanese people during World War II. So we have a really bad history of, the United States Census Bureau is not supposed to share information with other agencies, but there's definitely reason to believe in the immigrant communities that they may not follow with that order. Like I said, with the Circle K example, right? So ICE agents are not supposed to just randomly stop people on the street and ask them for their documentation, but they've been doing it. So I think you have this combination of a history of a country where the United States Census information has been used in the past to negatively affect non-citizens, alongside an administration that openly flaunts the law on the books. I think it's a really bad combination and a really bad time to put citizenship on the United States Census.
All right, please join me in thanking our speaker.